Now, when a relationship breaks down, the emotional impact is obvious, but the financial reality can be just as tough. From legal fees and splitting assets to finding a new home and covering childcare, the costs can quickly add up. So if you're facing that kind of change, what should you be thinking about? Well, I'm joined by Victoria Parkinson, who is Head of Family Mediation at TLC, to talk about this. Thank you so much for joining us on Consumer Fight Back.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. This is one of those issues, I think, you're so caught up in the emotional turmoil and so many thoughts and decisions when a relationship breaks down.
Mm-hmm.
You're not really thinking about the financials, really, are you? So what should you be thinking about?
Yeah, you're right there. It can often be a real afterthought, can't it? When you suddenly think, we've separated, you're going through the emotions of that. And then you realize, wait a minute, there's actually so much more to come. And what that can lead to is people then sort of burying their head and thinking, trying to avoid the financial discussions. One of the things that we do at TLC at Talk, Listen, Change is we work with people through family mediation. So that's working with people to openly discuss the financial arrangements and say, okay, now you've separated, how are you going to move forward? And the starting point for that is always looking at what have we got? So let's start by looking at what our financial position and situation is. And that's often a very early stumbling block for people because it's really hard to know how transparent to be. And it's really hard to sit down and talk about money. That might not have been a conversation that you had often through the relationship. So that can be the trickiest part often is the beginning and is sort of getting going on, well, what do we have? And how do we then start to approach conversations about how we would separate off money? Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And I think sometimes maybe people who haven't been through this sort of, they have this hypothetical situation in their head where people are employing high up lawyers to, fling figures back and forth to each other. But that's not the reality of the situation. And I think a lot of people are scared by what their financial situation might be on the other side of a breakup. So how much might it cost to actually separate your finances when you're going into all of this?
Yeah, it really depends on the approach that you take. So there's 3 different approaches, fundamentally, I think. One approach to deciding how you're going to move forward is to just discuss it privately and decide privately. You do then have to take some legal steps, though. But the second approach would be through mediation, so deciding the arrangements through mediation. And then the third approach would be to go through court proceedings. I guess there's a fourth one as well of it being decided back and forth via solicitors. If you are just making the decisions yourself and you're just privately agreeing them, and then you then apply for your divorce, and then you need a solicitor to draft what we call a consent order, so a legal order that says this is what we've agreed, then the cost of that would be about £2,000 to £2,500. So it's £612 for your divorce. Drafting of the consent order by a solicitor is £1,000 to £1,500. The tricky part is the reaching the agreement. That's the tricky part because often people can't just do that privately. Often they need legal advice that they can get from a solicitor, or they need legal information that they can get through mediation. They can't just sit privately and say, hey, let's, this is what we'll do with this. This is what a pension sharing order is. This is what that business is worth. This is, it's complicated to do that without some professional input. If you go to mediation and you work through the arrangements through mediation, then you'll be looking at spending probably an average per person of £400 to £800. If you go to solicitors, your fees are going to be significantly higher than that. They're going to be in the thousands if the solicitors are going back and forth. If you can't agree through mediation or back and forth via solicitors, if you go to court proceedings, you're looking at £5,000 to £30,000 per person. This is one of the reasons that we do what we do, and it's one of the reasons that solicitors will often refer out to us when they're working with people, because if you go to court proceedings, you are looking at tens of thousands, whereas if you can come to mediation and sit together with a mediator to chat through what are my options, what would work well, how can we move forward here, and also to just manage the conflict that comes up with that. Of course, conflict is going to come up. You're having conversations that you never imagine you'd be having. The dynamics in a relationship are so different when you're separated. Then, of course, that's going to be really tricky to do. If you do that through mediation, it is a way of you keeping your costs lower than through court proceedings or other avenues.
That is extremely interesting. And Victoria, if you go down the mediation route, do you still have those same sort of options presented to you as what maybe a solicitor may lay in front of you?
So the two sort of things to comment there, I guess. One is that what a mediator gives is legal information. So what I always sort of say is the information I would give to one person, I'll give the exact same information to the other. So I would give them information about, I mentioned before, pension sharing orders. So what is a pension sharing order? How does that work? You know, so if one person has a big pension and the other doesn't have one at all, how could you equate that upon separation? I'm going to give them both information about that. What a solicitor does that's different, I guess, is that they sit with one person and say to them, this is what I would advise that you do. This is the information and this is what I think you should do in the best interest of you. And that support can be absolutely fantastic. It can also, of course, sort of elevate things to an argument where maybe if you want to take more of an amicable approach, then just the information is a better way of approaching it. And then you making your own decisions on that. So it is information that we give in mediation. But the other thing to mention as well is that in between mediation sessions, so people might come to 2 or 3 joint sessions of mediation together to discuss how they're going to move forward, people will often take legal advice. And that might be, say, your solicitor is $300 or $350 an hour. Then you may have a couple of mediation sessions, then each go and take some legal advice from separate solicitors, and then come back into a final session and finalise that. So then what you're doing is just minimising the cost of solicitors, but still able to go and get that individual perspective of, okay, this is all the information, these are discussions you've had in mediation, this is the perspective of the other person, this is what I personally advise you do.
So who covers legal fees? Or is that a silly question? You know, is it split down the middle, or...
Absolutely no silly questions. Definitely no silly questions, because I think the key thing when it comes to separation and mediation and divorce proceedings and that sort of thing is, you know, I've worked as a mediator for 16 years, so I understand divorce and separation. When you're going through divorce or separation, often it's the one and only time that you'll go through it. So you don't know these things. You don't know who pays for what and what covers what. And that is the first part where people, I think, need to be really kind to themselves and forgive themselves for. You know, you are going into something that you've not gone through before, you're not an expert in, and you are in the dark, and that's okay. Legal advice with a solicitor, you pay for privately. There isn't legal aid for that anymore. There is in very particular circumstances that involve domestic abuse. So that is in certain circumstances, but in most circumstances, you can't get legal aid with a solicitor anymore. So you just pay that privately yourself. Same as with the court fees that I mentioned before. Same situation, that like an average of 5,000 to 30,000 per person to go to court, that you would pay that privately unless you are eligible for legal aid, but that does depend on domestic abuse with a solicitor. Through mediation, it's very different. Through mediation, there's still legal aid. So if you are receiving certain benefits or you're on a lower income, then it's likely that you would qualify for legal aid, and that would then just cover the cost of mediation for you. So we have a legal aid contract at TLC, Talk Listen Change. Around 50% of our clients are publicly funded through legal aid. There is then also, this is going to get a little bit complicated, you don't need to remember all of this, there is a government voucher scheme at the moment that anyone who is discussing children in mediation can have £500 towards joint sessions of mediation, and that's for the family. So when they're coming together jointly. So it's a little bit complicated to wrap your head around, but, at TLC or any mediation service, they would go through that with the clients and explain it. The basic thing to know is that legal aid is still available for certain benefits and a lower income. And also there is other funding potentially available too.
Yeah, I think it's an extremely important point, and I think you actually laid it out very well there. And it's something that a lot of people would worry about in that situation, that they can't afford to separate, concerns about how they would pay for that or what they would do. So I think that'll be reassuring to quite a lot of people. Victoria, thank you. So how do you begin to plan for life on a single income?
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because I think that this is one of the scariest things for people when they separate is that you're going essentially from two incomes quite often and one household to one income and one household. But you still really want to have probably a similar size house, a similar kind of lifestyle, and that sort of thing. And it can be really scary and it can trigger real anxiety for people. And that can stem quite often from how we view money. And that's really developed in childhood, this view of whether money is seen as security or is it just seen as something that puts food on the table? Do savings make you feel more calm, or do you feel money's there to just be enjoyed? And it can be then really daunting to look at, well, how am I going to move forward? How is this going to work? And that's one of the things that people need to sit down and have the conversation about. Burying your head on that isn't going to help anything. Unfortunately, if you are going through a separation, then you need to keep moving. That's the most important thing. You need to keep moving and thinking, okay, I need to take mortgage advice, or I need to explore a mediator, or I need to look at a financial advisor, or I need to find out what my pension means, or I need to, it's about just keeping moving forward one step at a time and not freezing. It won't be easy. It's not going to be easy conversations when you're trying to separate money. It's really difficult for people. The most important thing is to not freeze and just keep moving forward through that conversation.
And just on that topic, how long does it usually take to work through all of this?
Well, it really depends, I guess, on what kind of money you're talking about. If you're in quite a straightforward situation where you maybe own a house, bits of savings, bits of debt, both got an income or one income that you've both been living off, then that's quite a straightforward situation. So to gather all that together and then put that into, we use something called a financial disclosure booklet. So we send it out to clients, they fill it out with all the bits and bobs, and then we exchange it so they can see what the other person's situation is. So if you're in quite a straightforward situation like that, house, bits of savings, bits of debt, you're going to be able to get that together very quickly. So it might take you a few weeks to get that together. And then you come into a session, you're discussing things, you'll go away, you may take 3-4 weeks to take mortgage advice, maybe take legal advice, have a look at your situation, get any bits of information that we were maybe missing, and come in again. And it may be that then, over a period of 3 to 4 months, you have a few meetings, you get all your bits and bobs together, and then you can reach an agreement. So it can be turned around quite quickly. That can really depend on the complexity of the situation. If, for example, so we have quite a lot of business owners through mediation. If you own your own business, you're kind of getting that valued. Or someone might, if they've not been in the business, they might have loads of questions about that. And that can be really difficult emotionally for the person who's owned the business, that while we were in a relationship, you didn't have all these questions. Now that we're separated, you're wanting to know about this bank account or how much that van would be valued at, or just the ins and outs of the business in a different way. That might take a little bit longer to get all the answers together and just make sure that everyone's really comfortable, everyone's been really transparent. But generally speaking, I would say a few months worth of appointments, depending on how quickly everyone's getting everything together. Once they've then reached an agreement through mediation, what you're getting then is a solicitor to draft a consent order. So you're getting a legal order drafted by a solicitor. And I would say 6 to 8 weeks for a solicitor to draft that once they've been given the agreement. Could be much quicker, may go a little bit longer if it's quite complex.
Well, I suppose once you're armed with all the information, at least you know what to expect and you have some sort of road in front of you. Victoria, thank you so much. I feel like we covered a lot of ground there and really, really appreciate it. That was Victoria Parkinson, who's Head of Mediation at TLC, which is Talk, Listen, Change.